Just think there's no light at the end of the tunnel. Like, when is this all gonna come to a head? People are talking about the bubble bursting with COVID and stuff like that, but it's gone worse. I think the only option for someone my age who has a qualification or has ambition will be to emigrate.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for joining. Thanks for listening in. I hope your weekend is going well. So like I kind of talked about before in the earlier comment, or in the post I made earlier, this is mainly going to be about the Ukrainian refugee issue. And it's mainly going to be about like what the impact of, you know, the amount of people that they're talking about, like 200,000 people coming into the country, because it's, I don't think, you know, especially with Ireland's housing crisis right now, because I don't think it's as simple as just saying, you know, they're going to restrict the supply for housing. Now, they are going to do that, and everything that's happened that's led to this point has been building up for the past like 10 or so years. So basically how I'm going to structure this is I'm just going to give a quick overview of why the housing stuff has happened, why this housing crisis thing has happened. And I'm going to talk about the supply stuff, and I'm going to talk about in other words, the supply for housing, and I'm going to talk about the demand for housing. That's the first part of it. So I'm going to kind of lead it in with that. And then the second thing I'm going to lead it in with is what are going to be like the sort of psychological consequences, the economic consequences of what's going on in Ukraine right now, and what's going on with kind of like the inflation and markets and all that kind of, and the financial markets and all that kind of thing, and where this is going to lead to, in particular, things like this right to housing referendum, the support that it'll get. I'm going to talk about the government's right to housing 2021 strategy that they talked about, why none of that's going to work, and what are going to be the consequences of all of this if nothing changes and if nothing is done, or if there's no big economic crash. Because I think honestly that this is one of the housing crisis is going to be one of the most serious issues that's going to hit this country, that's affecting this country, that's going to hurt this country, because it disproportionately affects young people in all sorts of tiny little ways. And if it's not fixed, it's just going to essentially hollow out Ireland. So that's the last thing I want to get into. And one more thing as well. This is not going to be, if maybe I didn't make myself clear enough, maybe in the comment before, but this is not going to be a kind of a, you know, Ukraine, Russia, which side is correct, which side is not correct, anything like that. I mean, personally speaking, I don't know enough about it to speak about that with any kind of confidence. You know, people have talked about like, you know, so the Azov battalion and neo-Nazis, and you know, and people have talked about, like, you know, vice versa, that like, you know, what, you know, Ukraine are defending themselves against, you know, Russia not acting the way that they should. I don't know the topic well enough. I don't have a sort of like a close investment in it. I'm just going to talk about how that stuff's going to directly affect Ireland in a sort of a, you know, whether you like it or not way, rather than have an actual like genuine opinion of kind of both countries or both sides, if that kind of makes sense. So yeah, with that, I suppose we'll get into it. So the first thing I just wanted to talk about there is just a general outline of why the housing stuff has happened. Why is it that we're in a position whereby you can be earning a median wage of like 30 grand, and you can be in Dublin, and 1/3 of your income, even more than that, can be going on rent, and why the events over the past couple of months have led to a change in the housing crisis. And I'll get onto that in a sec. So what caused the housing crisis, kind of roughly speaking? So the first thing is that after the collapse in the Irish economy in 2008, 2009 onwards, in order, as part of our agreement with the IMF, basically Ireland needed to make money. It needed to make money quickly, and so what it did was it set up NAMA, the National Asset Management Agency, and started gathering up all these kind of lands, all this kind of ghost areas, and started selling them to investors at just absolutely like fucking rock bottom fire sale prices. And so when different funds started buying everything up, what this kind of led to was essentially property speculation. So you'd have people who just buy this land, buy all these estates up at these kind of rock bottom prices, and would be allowed to sit on them. And due to kind of inflationary pressures that would be going on in the market, they could buy this land or this area at like price X, and then it would end up rising because of your inflationary pressures. And so this country hasn't had any kind of proper like vacancy tax or sort of like sitting on land asset tax or any kind of thing like that. I mean, some other countries have that, we haven't. So, or we haven't had it to a great degree. So that's led to a lot of people just sitting on these assets and sitting on this land, and it's led to kind of people just kind of not necessarily kind of budging with this land. So that has also led into a couple of other things as well. So it's not only the fact that like you have all these investors and these groups sitting on this land, you also have issues of like one of the things people haven't talked about necessarily as much is that, like, I know like inflation and whatnot right now is a big issue, obviously, but it was always kind of a big issue in the sense that, like, not to now, but like I was just doing a little bit of digging, and between like 2014 and 2020, new builds increased by about 10% year on year, and existing dwellings increased by 5% year on year in terms of like inflation, in terms of like input costs, right? And in terms of the price of stuff like cement, oils, varnishes, that kind of thing, they've gone up by about 20 to 25% since 2015. And also you've had this kind of thing like profit margins, profit issues as well. So like in the NAMA process, like you have a lot of these development land auctions, and typically sites tend to be acquired by kind of the most optimistic people, your most optimistic bidders, and therefore property, in terms of how viable the property is to develop, that kind of margin is basically kind of eaten up. And then we have other things as well. Now, I mean, there are some issues which are like, you could kind of argue they're kind of good that they're in place. For example, you had the 3.5 income central bank policy for people buying mortgages. But that has certainly slowed down the ability of people to get a mortgage, to get on the housing ladder, and all of that kind of thing. And the other thing too is, like, I was looking at a few estimates of kind of input costs and how much it would cost for, especially with the input materials, how much it would cost for, say, if you built an apartment, right? How much would it be how much of an ROI could you generate from that? So I got some numbers here. Again, these are kind of academic-y kind of numbers, and if the past 2 years have anything to go by, how much of these kind of models go by. But there is some truth to it. It does. Some of these numbers do kind of make sense, and I'll go into some of the kind of like how many houses are predicted in terms of our population are required for the next bit. So there's things like I have a couple of projections up here. I'll share them in the chat later on, but it's if you say build a city centre apartment today, say in Dublin, right? That's going to cost you, costs going into it are going to run as high as about like 600 grand, right? And from a kind of a rental point of view, to kind of cover that cost essentially over a 10-year period, 20-year period, you're going to need rents of about, by the time everything's kind of run out and everything's kind of calculated, you're going to need rents of about like 1,700 euro. And when you're getting into rents of that amount, you're talking about like what? About 5 to 10% of people who can live, who work in your Facebook or who work as an engineer or whatever, can actually maybe afford that stuff. And again, with the whole working from home revolution thing that's kind of gone on right now, basically it becomes less. There becomes less of an economic incentive for certain groups, certain developers to actually go with this and actually push that forward. And there's other things as well. So I was taking a look at, so if you wanted to take a look at, say, the amount of property transactions done in the economy, again, you know, like more people who can get on the property ladder, more people who can get a mortgage or whatever, the more that they're taken out of the demand for the housing supply. You know, they have their own place and so on. So you can actually take a look at the number of housing transactions if you take a look at, if you type in Property Price Index Ireland, and you can download like all the, you know, the property transactions that have been done within the Irish economy. And one of the things I just took a look at is typically, like, if you take a look at the difference between like 2014 and 2021, the amount of houses and housing transactions, people just buying houses, has gone up by about 30%, but the increase in the average house price has gone up by about 60% in that period. So the average, again, maybe I should be, you know, you could talk about the median, or you can talk about like different areas in the country, because that's another important point to get into. In 2014, you were talking about a house price on average of about 214 grand for the whole country, and now you're talking about 335 grand. So you can see that, like, if the cost is far outstripping the amount of houses being bought, according to this, it's you clearly have an inflationary effect. And even things like, if you take a look at the development, or if you take a look at the construction of new housing developments, right? You end up with, over the past 2 or 3 years, let me just bring up the Excel thing I have here. Cool. So in 2020, we had like 20,526 new dwellings completed. The year before, in 2019, 21,000, and the year before that, 17,000. So the reason, a lot of the reasons why this you're seeing this mismatch between the amount of houses bought and the price is even things like the role of so the CSO even have numbers on the amount of purchases by non-household entities. So, like, you know, your investment groups, your REITs, your vulture funds, all that kind of thing. And out of all, if you take a look at, say, 2011, right, all purchases of new dwellings in 2011 were 3,293, of which purchases by non-household entities were 400 of that, right? So purchases by non-household entities as a percentage of all purchases was about 12%. If you get to 2020, the percentage of REITs, the percentage of non-household entities, all these kind of things, that number raises to about 40%. So what's happening right now is that you have these REITs swooping in, with making purchases within the housing market, and they're also willing to purchase these dwellings and purchase this accommodation at a higher price than what's asked. So they'll typically, I had an Irish Times article up about this before, but they'll go as high, or they'll go higher in terms of like about 20% above asking price, and that also leads to an inflationary effect within the housing market, and they're happy to do it because they can guarantee that they have the house. And also, we're into a period of considerable inflation right now. So if you're in a period of considerable inflation and you get into, say, a contract, buying houses is actually quite a good way to go, because the increase in prices will just end up inflating your effect away. And speaking of that, there's two more things that maybe are not as touched on, even with these kind of mainstream economist lads, that I just kind of like to bring up there. One of them is the role of the I have it here. I have the exact, bear with me 1 second. Yeah, so one of the things Fine Gael did in 2017 is they essentially Owen Murphy essentially brought in this legislation to whereby you if you basically wanted to if you put in a planning application, right, rather than going through the kind of your local authority, and then that gets looked over at Board Planala level. Board Planala, excuse me, are the kind of independent kind of housing body, or so-called independent, you know what I mean? Basically, in 2017, the legislation was changed so that housing authorities or local authorities could be completely bypassed completely. The problem with this, though, I mean, you can get into the issues of these kind of things, but one of the issues of that was you've ended up like clogging up the court system with all these judicial reviews, because people are rather than kind of like the different processes that can be brought along the way, because it's gone straight to Board Planala and then it enters judicial reviews. Basically, what you end up with is more and more people challenging these developers in court, and that has led to an increase in legal action fees, all this kind of thing. So again, you know, like this might make me sound like I'm, you know, this massively pro development kind of person, or, you know, whatever. I'm just talking about like all I'm talking about is the mechanisms that have impacted supply in all of these agreements. I mean, there are maybe solutions you could talk about. Again, how many of these solutions are there? I mean, like there's always going to be like an incentive to, say, develop around Dublin, but like I was talking about before with, like, say, developing a bunch of apartments, would you rather just sit on that land and just, like, you know, have the value with it, or would you rather have all this uncertainty with putting your costs in and inflation, and you don't know where that's going to go? And that's going to be a huge point going forward, because someone in the chat earlier posted a picture of a Business Post article. I just want to kind of read it out, because it's had a it's going to have a big impact increasingly going forward, and it's going to have increasingly a big impact going forward, and it's where essentially the housing a lot of that kind of housing issues have come from, because in terms of, like, again, this is since about 2015 or so, basically Fine Gael shifted over a lot of their social or a lot of, like, public housing development or social housing. Essentially, they try to shift it more and more towards these kind of private partnership agreements, essentially, is what they're called. So I'll just kind of read out the article here, because it is very, very kind of relevant going forward. And I think with that, hopefully, that's kind of a summary of, and obviously I'll talk about the demand stuff as well, what's going on as well. But I'll read out the article. So, construction firms threaten to down tools on housing and road schemes, right? Construction firms are threatening to pull out of state housing schemes and road projects, which are central to the government's plan, the Business Post has learned. The companies have warned that hyperinflation, that's interesting as well, they're using the term hyperinflation, means that works are no longer viable and they cannot afford to deliver them at the cost of steel, timber, diesel, and other materials that have soared in price. The projects involved are key to delivery of both housing for all, none of that's going to work, I'll get into that in a sec, and a 165 billion national development plan. The development comes as the government is being pushed under pressure by growing public sector wage demands, and as the cost of living continues to soar in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In the case of major infrastructural projects, this is the stuff I'm kind of talking about here, the state has a system of fixed price contracts. So firms who are in the middle of projects are contractually obliged to deliver on budget. However, many are saying they are not in a position to complete the work involved unless they are paid more. One contractor on a public project is understood to be at risk of losing 16 million due to rising prices, while even contractors on smaller community nursing homes fear that they will lose up to 1 million each. I'm just skipping down a bit. Unless we can bring some flexibility into the public sector, contract, nobody will be doing the public sector contracts, and the ones that are half done will be left there idle, he said. If construction firms pull out of fixed price contracts, they will lose the insurance bond they put up for the project and may go out of business altogether. The state will have to retender the work, causing delays and potentially leading to higher costs. Parliament said that both the NDP and the Housing for All plan were in peril and that more insolvencies among construction firms were likely unless the government took action. It's the perfect storm. I've never seen so much uncertainty and so much fear among players in the industry. And this is another important line. The price of steel, a key material in building projects, has tripled in the past year from 430 per ton to 1,500 per ton. Okay, so these public contracts. They've been involved in a lot of social housing, and these are starting to go belly up very quickly, and it's sort of a contagious effect because even if they stay into it, like, you know, I mean, what are you talking about in terms of like insurance bonds or insurance issued? I mean, if you're working in insurance, like, you're increasingly going to have to insure for these huge amounts of money because of these huge costs. So all of these things, and finally, of course, you know, we're talking about supply, right? Sorry, demand. The demand for housing. So, and where does the demand come from? The amount of people in your country. So, you know, I've just summed up the supply stuff, but in relation to the demand stuff, there's just maybe one or two things to flag here. One of them is that the CSO have numbers again on net migration for Irish people and basically non-Irish people, right? And the Irish population has during between 2010 and 2011, it's gone down, the native Irish population, by 135,000 people, and the non-native Irish population has gone up by 219,000 people. These are CSO numbers. There's nothing controversial about them, or like, this is just kind of like the most boring thing in a sense you can kind of talk about. So, and, you know, like a mainstream kind of economist might kind of go, well, yeah, but, you know, that if you take the difference between those numbers, minus 133,000 compared to plus 219,000, that's not going to have a profound effect on housing. And leaving aside the sort of organic increase in housing, the issue there is simply the fact that, like, the demand of Irish people for Irish houses, in a sense, is smaller than the demand of someone who's not Irish for a house. And that might sound kind of nonsensical, but what I mean by that is, like, simply put, like, if you're Irish, you know, you can live with your parents, or you can live with a friend, or you can live with an aunt or an uncle. And if you're not Irish, you don't have those contacts. So, in a sense, your demand for housing as a group is going to be higher than say, like, your average Irish person. There's nothing, you know, again, there's nothing kind of mad about that. It's the same if any of us was to go to a foreign country, we didn't know anyone, we'd have to go, okay, I need to find a place to stay. Whereas, you know, if you were coming back to Ireland after maybe living in Australia or wherever, you can kind of go, okay, I can live with my aunt or my uncle or whatever, and those people, you know, who are never going to rent anyway, you just, you know, live with them or whatever. So the kind of demand for housing with those two groups is going to be different anyway. And yeah, that was the other thing too. I kind of wanted to just kind of bring up as well. So there have been different projections in terms of, like, how much of a how short are we in terms of, like, houses being built. You know, I mean, like, I have a couple of ESRIs and civil service reports up here saying that, like, you know, we're building 20,000 and it should be 35,000. You know, okay, I mean, like, I did a quick kind of Excel thing there, like that, you know, comparing like the amount of housing transactions and the actual, you know, in order to make the housing transactions grow in the same way that the price has been growing, you would need an extra like 5 or 10%, but that's not even taking into account like these houses that are being bought up by these like REITs, and people who are not in the kind of housing area. So so yeah, you're short in that way, and with those 213,000. So like how many people would you need, roughly speaking? So if you've gone up like 213,000 over the past 11 years, right? So bear with me, I'm just going to do some maybe numbers quickly in my head. So out of those 219,000 that I was talking about there, right? Let's go for the past 5. Let's just go for the past. Okay, so just bear with me a sec. Okay, so 16, 17, 17, 19, 21. Okay, so you've got a number of 115,000 for the past 5 years, right? 150,000 increase in immigration, right? 150,000. Let's just assume. Ding ding ding. 5 per house, right? So 150,000. So that's 30,000, right? That you need 30,000 in terms of houses for those people. Now it's going to be more than that because of, like I said before, 40% are REITs buying things up, and then, you know, we're not even talking about like undocumented immigrants who are not in these numbers. So there's other things like that as well. But otherwise, let's just kind of project that number forward. So 5 years, 150, you need 30,000 houses, right? So 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18. So basically you would need, let's just round it off and let's just call it, you need 40,000 houses for 200,000 Ukrainians. Okay, let's just bring it up to that, and that's kind of in line with these, you know, the numbers that they're announcing. So you've got a 200,000 increase, which is the equivalent of a 4% increase in our population, if I'm doing the maths in my head correctly. And you're talking about, in order to kind of like keep things constant, I'm not even talking about actually solving the housing issue. I'm talking about just keeping the numbers constant. You need to add an extra 40,000, and that's not even talking about REITs, and that's not talking about that. So you would need to quadruple, 20,000. Yes, no, sorry, you need to triple the amount of houses, the new dwellings built, roughly speaking, every year. Now, again, someone can go to me and go like, well, you know, you can open up hotels and, you know, people can bring Ukrainians into their home. But the impact of that, if they are going to go with the 200,000 number, is absolutely, it's going to absolutely decimate the Irish housing market. It's going to decimate it. Like there's no capacity. There's no like those are the numbers that you're talking about. And you know, like I've heard these kind of things of you know, Fine Gael talking about, oh, you know, we can just bypass these planning laws. And again, this is predictable. You know, like I talked about before, one of the problems with the whole lockdown stuff is that you set a precedent for all this kind of like, you know, oh, we can do this now, or we can do that, or we can step out this boundary, or we can do this ridiculous thing. You know, the precedent has been set for all of this. So none of that's going away. It's all in place. All right. And where does that lead to? Critique says they'll be in hotels for a good while then. Yeah. I mean, like I said before, there's no, if you just want to keep things constant, you need to triple supply. And with the insane increase, I mean, what was the number I had there for steel? It's like let me just bring it up again. Just bear with me a second, folks. 430 to 1,500. I mean, would you? How many people are going to get involved or going to be encouraged to get involved in housing projects with this level of inflation? So there's no way that's going to happen. So you're right. Yeah, they are going to be stuck in hotels. They are going to be stuck in hotels. But this is the next step. Like, this is where things get a bit more bad in a sense, because roughly speaking, and again, like I'm sure anyone here can kind of correct me on a lot of this stuff. Like, I'm not an expert in the housing market by any stretch or anything like that, or even my kind of experience of it. But talking to people who are kind of older than me, and again, maybe people can back it up that, like, because I'm maybe showing my age, I'm a bit young here, but in 2010, in about 2010, 2011, 2012, it was actually quite easy to find a place. Would I be right in saying that? And then things only started getting kind of bad after like 2015, 2016 onwards. But it was bad, but it was bad in a different way compared to being bad now. So yes, you might be some guy who's like, you've got your degree out of wherever and you're sharing a house with whoever, and there's no chance of you owning your own home. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy, and you'll be at home watching your Netflix shows or whatever. But at the same time, you could still kind of do things, and this is the key. This is the shift. This is what I mean by, this is why I titled this The Next Stage, because we're now getting to the stage whereby, say, if 4 or 5 years ago, you might not have been able to own your own house, but if you were a young person, you would be able to go to university. You would be able to actually move to Dublin to get a job. You might be able to move to Dublin or to Cork or whatever to get your education. You might be able to do these kind of things. Now we're getting to the stage where that isn't possible anymore. That increasingly isn't possible. I mean, I've been talking to like kind of, younger people like that who are still in university, and they're having a hell of a time. Like, not in a good way, obviously, like an absolutely really fucking awful time. That they're rural based, and they're trying to move like some bit close to like getting into university, and they can't do it. They can't do it because it's too costly, or they can't find a place. And that shift has happened over the past few months, and that's a very different thing, because at least kind of younger people could act and could do things, and go to the, I don't know, the local technical university, and get training and this, that, and the other. That option is increasingly being eroded, and that's going to have a number of very, 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 very kind of serious impacts. But before I kind of get into that, I just want to talk about like kind of more the what's going to happen in addition. Like I've talked about like how impractical and how insane the idea of bringing 200,000 for a housing perspective point of view is. But I'm just going to go through like kind of the more kind of knock-on effects, and then I'm going to talk about where this culminates, and this culminates in the right to housing stuff brought in 2021, and the right to housing and the right to referendum stuff. So I've got a list of points here. I actually wrote them out earlier, but I just wanted to kind of expand on them a little bit, because it's not just going to be a case of like, oh, you just don't get housing. It's going to have a number of other impacts as well. So one of the things that's going to happen is, over the past couple of years, the hotel sector and the retail sector, they've just been kind of fucking like wiped out, right? Shops closed, people not being able to do this, that, and the other, that kind of thing. And so when you've got a kind of a government policy that comes along and goes, hey, we can put people in your hotel, and we'll pay for the room and we'll pay for them being there, you're going to take them up on your offer. Or I mean, I'm sure people have noticed it, like in your local town or your local area, that there's a lot more, like, for various reasons, there's a lot of like worker shortage signs. I mean, in a lot of industries, like this is a good time. It's a bizarre one, but like things have been better compared to the past couple of years. So there's an incentive to, like if you can bring down labor costs by increasing the supply of labor. So between those two things, there are going to be a lot of people who are not going to want it I mean, there are people out there who want this increase in people because, they genuinely like, and, the other thing too is that like, a lot of these, I mean, not the, by the way, I'm not talking about the kind of 60-year-olds that Philip Dwyer met. I'm talking about like actual genuine people, there's a difference between them, but I'm not, that's kind of going off the point. It's more like, there's a lot of people who are just gonna go like, oh well, we can just use these people for labor or just to kind of prop up my hotel. So there's a lot of that kind of sort of gone being kind of like self-interest as well. And the other impacts as well is that like, this whole thing of like Micheál Martin appearing on like British television and saying like, we're not going to be screening people. There's going to be no checks. Okay, well, that's happened historically before, whereby you've had issues whereby there have been wars and there have been criminals let out of jail, and those criminals have, fled the country and fled to other countries. So, and with this Ukrainian thing, again, I'm not saying I like understand it well enough, but there do seem to be like some enough well propagated reports that like, like that Zelensky released, a lot of criminals in order to fight, the Russians or whatever. What happens if a bunch of them end up on a plane and they come here and they're unchecked? Like what fucking madness are you going to end up like? Are there? I mean, we know from the kind of like, the Roscommon GAA thing and, Philip Dwyer's video and all this kind of stuff that there are a lot of people, there are a considerable amount of people who are not genuine and who are not what they say they are. That's kind of taken for granted a bit. Well, that's kind of true, but like it gets even more kind of serious with it. Like what kind of people are, going to come in, and that's probably going to lead to an increase in crime. I mean, like there was a thing that was being shared around about this what Ukrainian one who's acting as a prostitute out of a house he was that she was held up in, or that a bunch of that basically a bunch of Irish people took her in. So there's going to be an increase in these kind of crimes, and it's going to be on all sorts of ends. Like, so it's going to be kind of crimes on people who are not properly checked coming in. But I mean, like, 99% of people, like, or a lot of people who are taking in these Ukrainian refugees, like I'd say a lot of them mean well and all this kind of stuff, but how many of them are going to be like predators, like, that they can fuck around with or use a refugee for God knows what? Again, are these people being screened, from the Irish end? And that's another issue that's going to crop up. I mean, I could see that kind of fucking massively horrific effect whereby you'll just get cases of some sick fuck who's just abused a bunch of refugees because he could get away with it. So this is another issue that's going to happen, and that's going to be there. Another issue as well I'm kind of seeing, and it's kind of a, it's kind of no surprise, but it's kind of like, I suppose, like, so for example, I'd say the majority of people here are, vaccine free. And, if you're not, who cares? So as long as you don't kind of force it on other people or whatever, that's kind of my thing a bit there. But I think people have been kind of struck by, how easy it was to turn a considerable percentage of people in the population against people who just didn't take the vaccine, like how quick that was, and how a lot of like we had stuff like, there was a Fintan O'Toole article talking about like, how the people who didn't take the vaccine are fascists, egotists, or paranoics, like genuine, like, you kind of hear this kind of on the left stuff, like, far right inciting hatred. No. That Fintan O'Toole article and things like that is actual inciting hatred talking, like what I'm doing now, I'm talking about like an iron law of economics, and I'm providing numbers. That's not hatred. That's just like, this is just kind of like using numbers and whatnot. Turning a whole group and, calling them all paranoics or fascists or whatever, that's actual inciting hatred. And so my point being with that is, if that can be turned into on the so-called vaccine free, what else can that be turned on? And, like I've, kind of talking to a couple of like normal people or whatever, there does seem to be that little bit of kind of animosity towards actual kind of ethnic Russians who just like nothing to do with this kind of creeping in. And there's also an increase to, in animosity towards like, towards actual, Ukrainians, in terms of like, and that stuff, something I could see happen in terms of like, why did this Ukrainian refugee get on the housing list before me? And, again, like I said before, I think a lot of these people that they've been fucked around with, and they're being used by Gone Bean Hotel people, or fucking, the Irish government, or whoever. I'm talking about the genuine ones here, like, but you're talking about actual, like, the stuff that people here are accused of, that there is a bit of a risk of that happening increasingly if you're just alienating people by, putting, say, a refugee on a housing list before an Irish person who's been on that, or like an ethnic Russian, because the price of electricity has gone up 24% in 1 month, and then your Russian neighbor who's nothing to do with this. Like, this whole frenzy is just going to accelerate that and going to kick that off. But holy shit, 65 people! Wow. Sorry. I was just taking a look at the chat there. Pure Bloods for life. Yeah. But that goes into a few more components of this, which is the political aspect of this. Now, the political aspect of this is the role of voting blocks. Now, the next few points I was going to talk about are a bit more speculative, but I do think that to some degree they are quite plausible, and they do need to be taken into consideration going forward. And one of the things is very, very, very simply the fact that Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and the Green Party, people hate them. People don't like them. I mean, for example, take Leo Varadkar. I mean, Varadkar is the only Taoiseach in Irish history to takes more than one count to be elected in a general election. These people are not liked. They're not liked in a lot of ways. They're not liked in a lot of areas, and they know that. I mean, maybe some of them care, some of them don't care. I mean, there was an article I was reading earlier today about, like, Micheál Martin being groomed for this like European Commissioner job, and he'll just kind of move on from that after Fianna Fáil. I think a lot of these lads kind of like see, the way, like, you might work for company A or company B. They kind of see this. A lot of politics is the same thing. They work, they have their job in this position in Ireland, and then they go off to some bureaucrat job in Brussels or the UN or wherever, right? But here's a few things. But I haven't seen as many people talk about this, so I suppose I'll kind of just get into it now. You can become an Irish citizen under Irish law. You can vote and all that if you're a refugee under 3 years, right? Under 3 years. So that would put, obviously we're into March, April 2022. That will put us into 2025, whereby, if you have Ukrainians coming in under the refugee, they could become Irish citizens and they could vote in 3 years' time. Now, this doesn't line up exactly, but how the general election kind of system works here in Ireland is you have to the limit, the term that a government can last is maximum 5 years from the first meeting of the Oireachtas, I believe, after your general election. So that means the maximum amount of time the government can last is February the 20th, 2025. Now, obviously, based on those timelines and the refugee stuff of 3 years, that means a lot of Ukrainian refugees could not become voters. But even if the Ukraine stuff was to end tomorrow, I could see there being a real incentive in terms of trying to turn those Ukrainian voters into their own voting bloc, in terms of voting for Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, or the Green Party. In other words, and again, it could. How much can you blame these people? I mean, obviously some of them are going to be kind of, like scammers, and people have talked about that before. But then, like, you've taken some of them in from a war scenario, and you've given them all this stuff, and will they vote for you? Yeah, I mean, there might be a bit of an interesting thing too, because like the Ukrainians are a bit more. They seem to be more kind of like conservative on average, and they're less likely to vote for the kind of mad progressivism stuff. But that plan at turning a lot of these people into a potential voting bloc is there, or there's a bit of a spin, because like I said before, one of the let me just take a drink of water there. One of the incentives of all of this is, I mean, like I said before, one of the consequences of the lockdowns, is that you've set a precedent for, kind of acting more sort of like authoritarian, if that makes sense, or kind of like willing to step out and bypass legal procedures. So is there going to be a thing in a few months' time where it's like, in order to help Ukrainian refugees fit in better, we're going to decrease the citizen requirement to vote from 3 years to 2 years, say something like that. And of course, like, there could be a general election between then and between that 2025. I mean, I've talked about this before, the rising inflation, rising costs and everything, the unpopularity of the carbon tax, and the other thing as well is, like I said before, it's going to be very interesting when you get to December of this year with the whole rotating Taoiseach Varadkar thing, because what's going to happen there is that a lot of the senior members of Fianna Fáil, like I said before, basically Martin hasn't as much control of the senior Fianna Fáil guys, I think, as say like Fine Gael have of their own members, or Varadkar, or Coveney. I mean, Coveney is probably the real kind of like control in the sense behind Fine Gael, but I'm not going to get into that. So basically, that in itself could result in disruption between all of those parties in that area, and that could kind of drive something, especially if like that could be something there, like like in other words, like you have this image of like Varadkar taking power again, and then Fianna Fáil look weak, and it's a boost to them in terms of polls and voting. But also, the other thing too is that this housing stuff and this pricing stuff is increasing very, very quickly. But there could be a bit of a disruption there as well. And the other one as well is obviously, like, with the big increase in people and basically the big increase in, or the increase you've seen recently in terms of cases, the virus cases and the the coronavirus cases and all that kind of stuff. The thing there is, it could be an effect of like, like, rather than say blame it on the decline, the consequences of these adverse reactions and what have you, that it's blamed on the increase in population that comes into Ukraine, and then that comes into Ireland, and then it's justified as like, well, we did it, but we had to do it to save these people, but because of that, we need to bring in certain procedures, or we need to bring in some more kind of vaccine lockdown precautions. So it's kind of like, okay, we've got a lot more people now, we bring in the masks, that kind of thing. That could be maybe an issue that's kind of coming. Again, that's very speculative, but it could be there as well. But this is going to lead to maybe one or two more things, and this is where the right to housing issue comes in. Okay, this is where the right to housing issue comes in, because I've talked like I've titled with the stream, the next stage of this. You've got a lot of young people who increasingly don't even have the ability to they don't even have the ability to do the basic things in terms of like training, in terms of going to university, in terms of moving out of a rural town that they don't like or whatever. What's that going to lead to? That's going to lead to a couple of things. That's going to lead to them becoming increasingly desperate and them looking for increasingly more out there solutions to the problem. So some of them will do stuff like try and leave the country. But as well as that, some of them will look towards more extreme politics. And one of the things I've kind of seen a little bit seep in, I mean, you can see this kind of like, if you're on Facebook and you follow any of these kind of or if you're in any of these kind of left groups, an example of this might be like Irish Simpsons fans, right? There's a lot of, some of the memes are kind of funny, but there's a lot of kind of left-wing kind of people and, all that kind of thing in there. Kind of left-wing, kind of younger people in there. And one of the things you see is, and just kind of even talking to like kind of just younger people, there's a little bit of a sort of a envy against kind of older people, that they got the house and they were able to work a kind of a below average job and still own a house, and that like you can absolutely excel and do all the right things, and that's kind of not there for you if you're like 20 or 25 years old. And so, or even stuff like looking at this kind of older sort of boomery generation, for lack of a better phrase, and then kind of like they are able to kind of sit the 2 years out, and younger people lost a lot of opportunities and lost a lot of chance. So my point being is that like there's a little bit of like essentially bitterness, or maybe a little bit of some justified, some maybe not as justified, that's seeping in. And the other thing as well is one of the issues we have with dealing with the housing crisis is you're not allowed to talk about the demand side. There, like it always strikes me as ridiculous, because there's nothing racist or far right about talking about an iron law of economics. It's really simple. It's more people, more demand for facilities or housing or whatever. But not only have you got these kind of maybe younger people who are going to look for these kind of more extreme solutions because they are in a bad fucking place. The issue that we might have is that like I was talking about this before in a couple of streams ago about kind of how Ireland chooses its elites and how Ireland increasingly selects for compliance and compliant people rather than people who are naturally good leaders or who have a natural creative vision. And how that's kind of done is through the university system, right? So if you take a bunch of people and then you put them through a university course and say philosophy or English, and they don't learn any skills, a lot of the time they end up being these kind of like, this guy, this philosopher guy Turchin called them like, an overabundance of elites. So you've got a lot of people striving for these elite positions that are above them and that they don't kind of necessarily deserve in a sense, but they still kind of want them and they still kind of go for them. So the point being is that like they don't have as many kind of useful skills in a sense. They only have a kind of a compliance to the system. And because of that compliance to the system, if they mention anything about like the demand for housing, they're going to get in trouble, or they're going to get ostracized or anything like that, And so because of that, the only solution that they're going to have is, well, what about that boomer who's got a house? I should have that house, right? And this is where the right to housing stuff comes in, because you're creating a big swath of angry, compliant young people, and who are going to look for solutions to the problem. And one of the solutions is going to be, leave the country. Another one is going to be put up with it. Another one is going to be, nationalist politics and whatnot. But for a huge chunk of them, especially the ones who are kind of, in a sense, kind of groomed to be elites, the ones that the Burkean always kind of take the piss out of, with the, I'm sure everyone, or I'm sure a lot of people have seen the thing floating around on like, the Burkean basically trolled Icarus poetry. Those are the kind of people. They're going to look for more and more extreme solutions. And then what does the government come out with? Right to housing. So you've got that voting block there. And then, like I was talking about before with the Ukrainian refugee potential voting block, now you've got a group of people who have an incentive or an interest, not necessarily because they're bad people or whatever, but they've got an interest to vote for this kind of right to housing thing. And that's where things get messy, because it can be seen, it's going to be carried on because of the momentum of the past couple of years of, the government becoming increasingly authoritarian, and also with the fact that a lot more young people are going to be left behind. You're going to have an increased voting block or voting interest in such a bill. And that's where this stuff leads. And it's, I don't know, like I still think that, like, I don't think it would necessarily work if it was to be passed off. And I'll talk about maybe a couple of reasons why. I mean, one of them is that, like, I would say there would be enough kind of maybe journalists or people, or enough kind of older people, or enough boomers who might be able to kind of like figure it out. But the other components to that as well, which kind of back that up, is if you take a look at the sorry, I should have said this before I talked about the kind of boomer thing, but the right to housing bill, right? The right to housing bill that was brought in sorry, no, sorry, I'm getting mixed up. The Housing for All plan that the government were talking about in 2021, they talked about stuff like shared equity with buyers, right? Now there's a few issues there. So the right for all plan, right? They talked about like 40 billion. We're going to build an additional like 30,000 houses and whatnot. 40 billion a decade, 4 billion per year, so that the government act as a kind of like, they're gonna enter the housing market, and they're gonna start like, buying stuff up, right? Well, the problem with that is, who are those houses going to go to if the government enters the market and starts buying them up? And also, if they start going into the market and buying things up, that's also just going to create an inflationary effect. And also, who are those houses going to go to? And then the second thing they've talked about another couple of things. They've talked about like, shared equity in terms of like helping a younger couple or whatever getting on the housing ladder. Well, I mean, the problem is like, we'll supply, or we'll help out with like buying your house if you let us own like, I don't know, 50% of it. If you did that, you would see a corresponding increase, I would say, in prices of like say 50% to top that. So you'd inflate prices even further. And what happens if the housing market ends up crashing, and the government just, well, we own 50% of your house. We'll help you out. We'll buy out your part, and we'll that'll be that. We'll you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. I mean, you don't have to go down the you don't have to go down the whole, like, I mean, I'm not like the World Economic Forum and all that kind of stuff. There is an awful lot of influence and truth to that. But like even on a local level, the problem is the precedent has been set with the past, like coronavirus stuff for the past few years, and the incentives are there from all these different groups of people, all these different factions of people, for this to be a possibility, like, and then there's also another component to this as well, which is the fact that, like, if there is a severe housing shortage, if you've got a bunch of angry people, if people are becoming more and more at risk of becoming homeless, at the very least, you could definitely see like an increased incentive to get people, especially with the Ukrainian stuff, into houses where they kind of shouldn't be with, like, I mean, Dave Cullen has talked about this. Oh, you've got like a bunch of you've got a bunch of free rooms in your house. We might stick a tax in that house, and if you don't have people within that house, then yeah, you'll have to pay a huge penalty, or what have you. I mean, like, if you don't think that'll happen, I mean, again, a lot of this is just speculation, but like, things are getting kind of hairy enough out there. I mean, like, I'll give a couple of examples. Like, there was an announcement there by, I think, SSE Electricity, and they were talking about the fact that, like, they're going to increase electricity bills by like 25% over the next month. So, like, these costs and these things are going up and up and up and up and up. And the other thing as well is, and again, I haven't seen, like, I've gone looking for this stuff and I couldn't fucking find it. Well, I found a Department of Finance report on it, but basically we're 230 billion or 240 billion in debt, in national debt, right? And right now, with the inflationary impact that's hitting across Europe, basically, we don't have a monetary policy unless it affects Germany, right? And Germany are having quite considerable inflation, and I'm sure everyone here has heard the whole thing about, like, Putin pegging the ruble to gold, and demanding the that Russian gas be bought in rubles from the Germans. If there is significant inflation within the German market, the ECB, because the ECB is essentially Germany, they're going to push up interest rates. If they push up interest rates, what that is going to lead to, especially in terms of servicing our debt, right? So just maybe a little quick thing on bonds, and hopefully I can kind of explain this kind of coherently, right? Government issues a bond, right? You pay €100 for that bond. Government gets that money then, and then it pays you, say, I don't know, fucking €110 in 5 years' time or whatever. That's how a lot of the national debt is made up. It's made up of Ireland issuing bonds and whatnot. So in general, the relationship between bonds and yields is something along the lines of this, right? It's not always like this, but it tends to be kind of mostly like this, right? So if interest rates go up, in this case, what I'm predicting is the ECB interest rates go up, then the price of the bond is going to fall, right? And the yield is going to fall. No, sorry. If interest rates rise, the price is going to fall. The price of the bond is going to fall, and the yield on that bond has to rise, right? And vice versa. If interest rates fall, the price of the bond has to rise, and the yield has to fall. So if interest rates go up, it's going to be harder for the Irish government to raise money, okay? And at the same time, if interest rates go up, what about all the private debt we have? What about some family who is on a standard variable rate mortgage, although the Irish mortgage market is made up primarily, a big chunk of it is fixed rate mortgages right now, because household debt in Ireland is about 150 billion, and I think the whole private sector debt is about, I'm not entirely sure, and it's about 800 billion. I think it's quite a considerable amount of money. So I was looking into a Department of Finance document. I'll see if I can bring it up there. Actually, no, I'll probably get stuck if I go looking for it. But basically, they were talking about, oh yeah, well, if there was an interest rate hike, that wouldn't be that big a deal, because most of our bond yields are in most of our bond contracts are in the short term. Yeah, well, what happens just going a little bit further and issuing bonds right now? All right, and also, there's also the problem of the fact that, and the Department of Finance and the Irish government have talked about this, that our corporate tax receipts, because of the fact that our corporation tax has gone up, and something like 20-25%, again, I don't have a precise number on it, of our tax receipts come from like these multinationals, that's going to drop off considerably in 2023, because of the fact that like our corporation tax rate is going to go up from 12.5% to 15%, right? So Germany do that. We've got all that interest service. Meanwhile, your inflation is going up. You've wrecked supply chains for 2 years. This Russia-Ukraine stuff comes along. It's going to get more expensive for you to buy your daily essentials. And if it gets bad enough, then you're going to see a sort of a weird mix of prices going up, but certain asset prices completely collapsing. So, and how that'll happen, how that mechanism works would be something like, I can't afford to pay my electricity and I can't afford to buy food this week. I need to generate money quickly. So what do? Well, I don't need my car anymore. And so I go out, I go on DoneDeal or whatever. Well, yeah, well, maybe not DoneDeal, but you know what I mean. I go out there, put my car up, and I just need the fucking money to pay my other stuff. And because I need the money desperately, I'm going to set a low price for my car. And then that's how I service inflation. And then I just go, and I just go, and I go, oh, fuck, I hope this Ukraine stuff works itself out and the inflation goes away. And that's going to be the sort of like up and down effect that's going to work. In other words, a decline or a switch out of certain assets, they're going to decline in value because people are going to need to liquidate them quickly to kind of go for their essentials. This is if things get really bad, by the way. And then they're going to like move into things like commodities and, kind of raw usable goods like that. I mean, like even stuff like crypto. I'm just thinking out loud here. Like crypto is, it's great, and it's well worth owning some crypto. But at the same time, people are going to want maybe oil or gas or whatever, or these kind of things. So like one thing I could see happening is that, like, if Russia get away with this kind of like exchanging things in rubles and exchanging things in rubles, and then you've had your whole economy kind of work on your oil and your gas, that Russia could potentially become very, very rich. Although I'm just kind of like, I'm just thinking out loud. But the thing is, like, all these things mean that what's going on right now, I don't know when it's gonna fucking pop, but it can't last forever. It can't last forever, and it's impossible that any sort of attempt will be made to, because, like I said before, to keep the housing market consistent, you're going to need to triple the amount of houses built, right? So what's that going to lead to? All of that further on. Well, it's like I was talking about before a couple of streams ago, about with kind of elite compliance. They're just going to come up with more ridiculous, ludicrous decisions, and kind of younger people and a lot of other people are going to become increasingly desperate out of the whole thing. And if the thing drags on a bit more, if the thing drags on a bit more, what's going to happen is that more and more young people are going to become disillusioned. They're going to leave the country. Ireland, in a sense, is going to become more and more like hollowed out, and there's going to be more like actual genuine inequality. There's going to be like rich patches around the country, like your IFRC in Dublin, and then it's going to get rougher for a lot of people. That's if the kind of things manage to limp along. But if they don't, well, if they don't, this housing thing is going to come to an end very, very quickly, because it's going to end up with like a lot of people leaving, people losing control, and that's when things get a bit more uncertain. So that's where all this leads to. All of this is leading to a right to housing referendum, and all the sequences and all the places are there, but none of it will be sustainable because of the economic forces that are going on right now. So anyway, that's it for me. Geez, I've been going for a long time. I think I've been going for an hour and 15, hour and 20. Fuck. Just checking in there. There's 41 people here. That's mad. I like that. I think there was like 60 people here earlier, which is fantastic. Yeah, I think I might be maybe going over time a bit there. So I'm just checking if there's any comments there. Did anyone leave any 19 comments? No, not that many. Marion Failer says interest rate hikes would crush the property market. Germany is almost certainly afraid of inflation. Yeah, that's completely true. The Germans are obsessed with price stability in terms of like how they view a lot of the economic banking stuff. If there's any bit more of a significant inflation increase, they will increase interest rates. Germany's almost certain, so the ECB probably jacked them up and kill housing prices a bit. Unfortunately, this will make mortgages more expensive, so houses will still be unaffordable. Yeah, that too. And just to address that as well, obviously, like if you're on a mortgage and if you're on a standard variable rate and that goes up, and with inflation, your money is increasingly going into mortgage. Less of it is going into like disposable income, that kind of thing. People who are in mortgage arrears, like there's something like 80,000 households who are in that position. They're going to be looking, holy shit, how do I pay that? I need to sell my gold or jewelry or car at a massively discounted price, and that's when you get this kind of combination of a sort of a deflationary spiral that people like, that and a sort of kind of inflation in general goods and a deflation in certain assets. That's a spam, Susan one. That's a spammy comment. Would be good to put refugees in the central complex. Maybe build. Great stream. I reckon rates will have to go up, and I feel a lot of people will fall into serious debt. Yeah, no, you're right. But there's a lot of people in serious debt already. Like that's the fucking worrying thing there. So I mean, like, even though our Irish household debt has gone down, it's still about like 140 billion or so. Like, you know, there's so many people out there who have, like, you know, massive loans or loans on, like, you know, a fucking holiday or a fucking university course, or, you know, that kind of thing. So yeah, no, it's a serious problem, and I can't really see like a kind of a clean way out of it, because we're just so, households are so indebted, the private sector is so indebted. We, you know, and a big chunk of that, or a considerable chunk of that, is about to go in 2023. So but yeah. Okay. Think you're way off on housing going pop. We aren't in a credit bubble. Vulture funds have a bottomless pit. Well, it's a different one this time though, because that was, yeah. So like what drove the 2008 2009 thing was the collapse in interest rates that allowed a huge percentage of people. It turned into kind of a giant Ponzi scheme, basically. And so this time it's a little bit different, because we have an increase. We have a general increase in like day-to-day living. So it's not just the fact that like you're normal living and then you've got a bubble. It's the fact that like the cost of everything is going up, and because the cost of everything is going up, you need to get money to help yourself out with that cost of living going up. So like my example with like selling your car or whatever, you know, if you can't pay your bills, you get desperate and you start selling stuff. And to make the money, you set the price kind of as low as possible, and then the price of everything starts going down. It's not you're right, like it's not the same thing, but you know, households can only pay so much. If you've got all these outstanding loans, you can only pay so much. That kind of thing. James says, I'd love to see what percentage of resident properties owned by foreign investors, but now the property is being souped up by is it sustainable for these foreign investors to keep these rents so high at current levels? No, it isn't. It isn't sustainable. And it's like I was talking about earlier, because the increase in like these inputs and building materials are going up to such a degree. I think a lot of people are just going to sit on maybe the land they own. Would basically be my answer to that. So let me just see. Well, if they're involved, tell them put plenty windows in the wall. You can go let us talk. Yeah. You know, it's funny. I'll leave after this. I'll kind of log off after this point. But you know, I was kind of thinking like, you know, like how can we how would we potentially get out of this situation kind of in the future, or stop this from happening later on? And beyond kind of controlling, having our own, you know, bank, you know, you need to kind of like secure your own, because here's another thing as well. I talked about this before. There's actually a strike planned, I think, for April the 11th for the truckers, because of the cost of fuel. Now, that's obviously significant because the thing is, with Ireland, everything is done by truck, right? And only 1% of goods, I think, are transported actually using the railway system. So if there was a significant increase in fuel costs and whatnot, it's going to get actually just quite simply harder to transport goods around. I mean, that was one of the things the truckers were talking about a few months ago, that like they were saying like, oh, it's harder for us to justify turning up to work in the morning because the costs have just gone up so high. But again, because that's the problem with like a lot of Irish economic policy, they've centralized everything among these few areas. So, rather than having a sort of, in a sense, kind of diverse economy, we have like a big chunk of it built on multinationals, or having a transport infrastructure rather than kind of diversify to deal with these kind of things. It's built entirely on like trucks, basically. So you think these housing prices will be higher in 2 years' time? Oh fuck, I haven't a clue. I have a clue. Like things will go up for the time being. But like, it's like a lot of people predicted the whole thing would come crashing down in 2008, 2009, and what they did was just they slashed interest rates completely to keep the whole thing kind of limping along. And even like, I've kind of heard this before about like the why did the lockdowns happen, and that there was a financial incentive in terms of reducing the velocity of money and all that kind of thing. But yeah, that aspect is like, putting a precise date in this is something. But like, if you're getting a 25% increase in your electricity bills in 1 month, like I don't know I don't know what else to say. Like, it's, that is that going to die down anytime soon? It's such a I mean, I was talking about before about the fact that inflation was having a big impact even in 2015 to 2020, but we haven't seen inflation like this anyway. That's for sure. But yeah, anyway, I've gone on for nearly an hour and a half, and that's probably enough. Thank you for everyone that tuned in. Might have went on a bit longer than maybe I should have, and thank you for all the comments. It's interesting as fuck. Anyway, as crazy as the whole fucking thing is, and we don't even, I mean, I haven't even talked about the fact that, like, the RIP stuff, that like, I mean, that certainly hasn't gone away. I mean, this kind of weird trend of like people getting badly sick or flus and kind of like coming up to March, April, that's certainly a strange one. And deaths around this time of year should be floating around like 90, but now they're floating around like 105, 110. So it's like that story that was floating around about that GAA, that poor lad, the Sligo GAA player who kind of dropped dead suddenly. So hopefully we'll be using the digital run in a few years' time. Actually, if I was going to make just a quick prediction there, I'd say, like, maybe how our ruble's going to be doing pretty well in the next while. I mean, if Russia have all the commodities and they're telling people, buy our shit in commodities, it might not be the Sligo. Oh, he did. Okay. Oh, I just want to offer that correction. So yeah, sorry about that. My bad, folks. I kind of heard of it in passing, but okay. Well, that's shit. That's sad. Fuck. Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. See, that's another problem too. Like, I mean, just someone, you start attributing stuff to the vaccine that isn't the vaccine. Yeah. Okay, we'll leave it there. Thanks, folks. Thanks again, and I'll speak to you later on. See you now. Bye. Bye-bye.